The silence didn't fall all at once. It arrived in sharp, calculated stages. It began at 7:00 a.m. when I picked up my phone to call the pharmacy, only to find a dead, black screen. No dial tone, no signal, just a hollow void where my connection to the world used to be. At 78 years old, you learn that silence usually precedes a storm, but I never expected the storm to be engineered by my own blood. I sat at my kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched a cup of tea that had already gone cold, staring at the useless device. I tried to tell myself it was a technical glitch, a service outage, or a simple mistake. But an hour later, the truth clicked into place with a slow, cold finality. I was at the grocery store, trying to buy a simple loaf of bread and a tin of tea, when the cashier looked at me with a mixture of pity and awkwardness. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Howerin," he whispered, "but the card has been declined." The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest as I walked home empty-handed. By noon, the final blow landed. The internet was gone. 3 cuts in 5 hours. It wasn't an accident, it was a surgical strike. It takes a special kind of cruelty to corner an elderly woman in her own home, to strip away her means of communication and her access to her own life, and still have the audacity to call it care. I retreated to my living room, the one sanctuary that still felt like it belonged to me, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 3:12 p.m., the front door opened. No knock, no request for entry, just the sound of keys turning, keys I had given to my son, Brian, 8 years ago when I still believed that family was a safety net, not a trap. Brian walked in with his wife, Laura, whose heels clicked across my hardwood floors with the cold, clinical rhythm of an inspection. They didn't look like family coming for a visit. They looked like a cleanup crew arriving to deal with an inconvenience. "Mom," Brian said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone people use for stubborn children or aging pets. "We need to talk." I didn't rise to meet them. I stayed seated, anchored by a sudden, fierce need to remain immovable. I asked him directly about the phone, and he had the nerve to sigh, as if my desire for basic communication was an exhausting burden for him to bear. "We turned off the plan, Mom," he said casually. "You don't need all that technology. It's confusing for you. We're simplifying things." Simplifying was their code word for stripping. Laura stepped forward, placing a thick manila folder on the table between us. She spoke of streamlining and safety, using the kind of rehearsed, sympathetic smile that felt like an insult. They told me my bank accounts were being consolidated, that my cards were paused, and that I would be given a small weekly allowance like a child with sticky fingers. They spoke of scams and my slipping memory, weaving a web of lies to justify their theft. I sat there, listening to the irony of being told I was being manipulated by the world, while the 2 people I had raised and supported were manipulating me right to my face. Brian leaned in, expecting me to crumble, expecting the softness of age to lead me into compliance. He told me it was done, that the legal wheels were already turning. They left as abruptly as they arrived, leaving the folder behind as if it were a tombstone for my independence. But when the door clicked shut, the trembling in my hands stopped. I reached for that folder with a steadiness that surprised even me. As I flipped through the pages, my breath caught in my throat. There, at the bottom of a financial guardianship intent form, was my signature. It was a forgery, sloppy, rushed, and arrogant. Brian had always been careless when he thought he had already won. He believed that because I was 78, I was already blind. He was wrong. I spent the night in the shadows of my kitchen, the forged documents illuminated by the pale yellow glow of the stove light. I reviewed every page, every line, every false loop of my own name written by a hand that didn't belong to me. By dawn, I realized the net they were casting was much wider than a phone plan. They were trying to erase me legally, to turn me into a dependent adult, so they could feast on the remains of my life. But independence isn't something you lose just because someone turns off your phone. It's a series of choices. And that morning, I chose to fight. I walked 3 blocks to the bus stop, my joints stiff but my mind sharper than it had been in years. I used my neighbor's phone to call the bank, my voice steady and ironclad. When I reached the branch, I was met by a manager named Ellen. She took one look at the documents I brought and the fire in my eyes, and she understood. "Mrs. Howerin," she said, her eyebrows rising in genuine shock, "I see several updates that were submitted yesterday. a caretaker authorization filed by your son." I told her the truth. I hadn't signed a single thing. The silence that followed was respectful, the kind of silence that precedes a counterattack. We spent the next 2 hours dismantling the cage Brian had built. We froze the accounts, issued new cards, and set up voice-authenticated security that no one, not even a son with a key, could bypass. Ellen told me that they had already initiated a full financial guardianship request, a legal hinge intended to lock me away. "Is it finalized?" I asked. "No," she replied, "not yet, but they filed the intent." Those words acted like a spine of steel. I left the bank with a temporary card and a folder of my own, a folder filled with the truth. As I walked back to the bus stop, my dead phone vibrated in my pocket. A single message flashed on the screen: "Service restored. Please contact administrator." They thought that by giving me back a tiny piece of my life, I would be grateful. They thought they were my keepers. They had no idea that I had just spent the morning reclaiming the keys to my kingdom. I stood on the sidewalk, the wind whipping my hair, and felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. It wasn't peace. It was the stillness before the storm. I was no longer the victim of their simplification. I was the architect of their reckoning. When I reached my front steps, I saw the 2 folders sitting on my table, the one of betrayal and the one of truth. They represented 2 versions of my life, the one they wanted to force upon me, and the one I was prepared to defend with everything I had left. I turned on the kettle, the hiss of the water echoing the fire in my soul. I was 78 years old, and my family thought I was slipping. They were about to find out that I wasn't falling. I was just getting started. The afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across my kitchen floor, but for the first time in days, I didn't feel cold. I felt heated by a singular, burning purpose. I sat at the table. The 2 folders laid out before me like the opening moves of a chess match. My son, Brian, and his wife, Laura, had underestimated the woman who had spent 40 years managing a medical clinic, keeping records of life and death with a precision they could never master. They saw a grandmother who baked cookies and forgot where she put her glasses. They forgot the woman who had navigated the complexities of insurance, law, and human suffering long before they were even born. The first test of my new resolve came barely an hour after I returned from the bank. The doorbell didn't just ring. It screamed under the pressure of an angry finger. I didn't have to look through the peephole to know it was Brian. He didn't wait for an invitation. He used his key, bursting into the hallway with the self-righteous fury of a man who believed he had been robbed of his own property. "Mom, what the hell did you do at the bank?" He shouted, his face a mottled red that matched the anger in his voice. He stormed into the kitchen, his eyes locking onto the bank folder I had intentionally left in plain sight. "I corrected your mistake," I said, my voice as level as a horizon. I didn't stand up. I stayed seated, using the chair as a throne of my own making. He paced the room, his movements erratic and jagged. He spoke of difficulty, of how I was making his life 10 times harder, and how he was only trying to fix my situation. When he mentioned my situation, he brought up a phone scam from months ago, a scam I had thwarted myself by hanging up. He was using my own competence as evidence of my decline, twisting reality, until it fit the narrative he needed to tell the world. "You forged my signature, Brian," I said, the words cutting through his rant like a blade. He froze. For a second, his jaw worked in a silent, uneven rhythm. He didn't deny it, he couldn't. Instead, he pivoted, claiming a lawyer had told him it was the best path since I was resisting help. He called a legal document just paperwork, as if a person's entire life could be summarized and discarded on a whim. My laugh, sharp and hollow, startled him. It was the sound of a woman who was officially done being the sweet old lady he expected me to be. I told him that if stealing my phone, my cards, and my identity wasn't theft, then he would have to explain the definition to me. But then the mask slipped entirely. As he paced, he began to complain about his own life, the mortgage, his daughter Cassidy's car payments, his own mounting medical bills. "My medical bills?" I asked softly. He froze again, realizing he had said too much. He wasn't trying to protect me from a scam. He was trying to protect his lifestyle. He was drowning in his own debt and had decided that my savings were the life raft he was entitled to hijack. He left in a storm of slamming doors and empty threats, but he left behind a vital piece of information. I wasn't fighting for my safety. I was fighting against his greed. By the time the evening mist began to roll in, I knew I couldn't stop at the bank. I needed to see the entire structure of the trap they were building. I went to the hallway closet and retrieved an old shoebox, wrapped in thick rubber bands. My husband had always told me to keep my papers where I could find them, and that night, those papers became my armor. I spread them out across the dining table. The property deed, the living will, past medical authorizations, and college payment receipts I had signed for my granddaughter, Cassidy. Not a single document gave Brian or Laura the authority they claimed to possess. They had relied on my perceived disorganization, never imagining I had kept a paper trail of every kindness I had ever shown them. The next morning brought a more subtle threat. A woman named Megan, a care coordinator from a senior support agency, arrived at my door. She was Laura's weapon, a professional stranger sent to confirm the lie that I was slipping. She arrived with a clipboard and a practiced smile, the kind people use when they think they are talking to someone who no longer understands the world. But as she stepped into my home, she didn't find the chaos or confusion she had been promised. She found a house that was impeccably tidy, and a woman who was waiting for her with a stack of evidence. "May I see your referral?" I asked, catching her off guard. I scanned the notes Brian had written about me, lies about unpaid bills and increasing confusion. I looked Megan in the eye and asked her a question that changed the entire dynamic of the room. "Do I seem confused to you?" She looked around at the organized folders, the clear labels, and the steady gaze of a woman who knew exactly who she was. The professional neutrality in her face began to crack. She admitted that I didn't seem like the person described in the report. I showed her the bank's fraud review. I showed her the property deed. And then Megan asked the most important question of all. "Mrs. Howerin, do you feel safe from them?" The honesty of the question struck me. I told her that I was safe, but that my family might not feel safe from me once I was through. She left me her direct card and told me that her report would state I was fully capable and that my family's interference appeared coercive. It was a small victory, but in the war for one's soul, there are no small victories. The following day, I took the bus to a small, fatting legal office 3 streets over. Mr. Kent, a man known for his sharp mind and lack of patience for nonsense, listened to my story without interruption. He looked at the forged signatures and the guardianship intent forms. "They've crossed several lines," he said, his voice a low rumble of authority. He told me about an independent financial advocate, someone who wasn't family, someone who couldn't be manipulated by Brian's pleas or Laura's schemes. I signed the forms to appoint one, creating a legal barrier between my son and my savings that no forgery could penetrate. As I walked home from the lawyer's office, my phone buzzed with a message from my granddaughter, Lucy. She was the only one who had reached out with genuine concern, the only one who hadn't asked about money. "Grandma, Dad's losing it. He says you're ruining everything. Are you okay?" I didn't tell her the whole truth yet. I didn't want to burden her with her father's sins. I simply told her I was fine and that I was correcting a mistake. The final piece of my preparation took place at my doctor's clinic. I insisted on a full cognitive and physical evaluation. I wanted it in writing, signed by a medical professional, that Mary Howerin was of sound mind and body. I wanted a document that would act as a shield against any future attempt to place me in a facility. The doctor, an old friend who knew my history of precision at the clinic, smiled as he handed me the report. "You're sharper than most people half your age, Mary," he said. I returned home and placed that medical report at the very top of my truth pile. I sat in my armchair as the dusk turned the room to shades of gray. I felt a strange sense of detachment from the people who shared my last name. They were no longer the son and daughter-in-law I had loved. They were adversaries in a legal and emotional chess match. I knew they were coming back. I knew that when Brian discovered his credit card, the one linked to my account, had been declined, he would return with even more desperation. And I was right. That night the phone rang, the landline, a sound that felt like a relic of a simpler time. It was Laura. Her voice was thin, brittle, and stripped of the saccharine sweetness she had used before. She told me I was punishing them. She told me I was crippling their family. She even threatened to escalate the guardianship if I didn't cooperate. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply told her that every call was being logged and that I was removing myself from their budget. The silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. It was the sound of a predator realizing the prey had developed teeth. I hung up the phone and looked at my reflection in the window. The lines on my face were deep, the marks of a long life lived with both joy and sorrow. But my eyes were steady. I wasn't just surviving a betrayal, I was dismantling it. I was 78 years old, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't being managed. I was the one setting the terms. I looked at the betrayal folder, thick with lies and forged signatures, and the truth folder growing heavier by the day with legal and medical facts. They thought they had cornered an old woman. They had no idea they had actually woken up a sleeping giant. The final morning of my transformation arrived with a sky the color of polished slate. It was a cold, honest light that didn't hide the cracks in the pavement or the frost on the windows. I woke up with a clarity that felt like a physical weight had been lifted from my chest. For decades, I had been the silent foundation of my family, the one who absorbed the shocks, paid the debts, and smoothed over the ruffled feathers of my son's ego. But that foundation had finally decided to stand up and walk away. I spent the early hours of the day finalizing my notes in a fresh notebook, documenting every call, every threat, and every blocked transaction. Paper trails, as Mr. Kent had said, are the only language the law truly respects. At exactly 9:15 a.m., my phone began to chime with a series of notifications that felt like a digital victory march. One by one, the automated systems I had reset at the bank began to reject the parasites. Transfer blocked. Account access denied. Secondary card deactivated. I knew exactly where Brian was at that moment, probably at a gas station or a coffee shop, staring at a terminal that told him no. He had lived so long on the assumption of my resources that he had forgotten they weren't his. He had mistaken my generosity for a permanent tap he could turn on and off. Now, I had cut the line. The fallout was immediate. By noon, the landline rang with such frequency that it sounded like a frantic heartbeat. I let it ring. I had no more words for Laura's brittle threats or Brian's manipulative pleas. Instead, I waited for the one person whose voice I still cared to hear. When the cell phone buzzed with a text from Lucy, I answered. She told me that the house was in chaos, that her parents were scrambling, and that her father was accusing me of betrayal. I told her the truth. I haven't betrayed anyone, Lucy. I've just stopped participating in my own disappearance. The confrontation I knew was coming happened at 3:00 p.m. Brian's car didn't just pull into the driveway, it skidded. He didn't use his key this time. I had changed the locks, a small but profound victory that felt like a physical barrier between my past and my future. He pounded on the door, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Mom, open this door, we need to talk." I walked to the door, but I didn't open it immediately. I stood behind the wood, feeling the vibrations of his anger, and realized I wasn't afraid. The fear had burned out days ago, replaced by a cool architectural resolve. "I will open this door, Brian," I said through the wood, "when you are ready to speak to me as a son, not a manager." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Eventually, his posture shifted. I could see his shadow through the frosted glass, the slumped shoulders of a man who had finally hit a wall he couldn't climb or forge his way through. I unlocked the door and stepped back. He walked in, but the energy was different. The self-righteous fury had been replaced by a hollow, gray exhaustion. He sat at the kitchen table, the very place where he had tried to simplify my life just days before, and looked at the truth folder I had prepared. I slid the medical evaluation across the table. I watched his eyes scan the words fully competent, sharp cognition, no signs of impairment. Then I slid Mr. Kent's notarized advocate form. Finally, I showed him the notes from Megan, the care coordinator, which explicitly mentioned coercive behavior from family. Brian's face didn't just turn pale. It seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. He realized then that I hadn't just been acting out. I had been building a fortress. "You went to a lawyer," he whispered, as if the word itself was a betrayal. "I went to a lawyer because my son went to a forger," I replied. The conversation that followed wasn't a fight. It was an autopsy of a relationship. He spoke of his debts, his failures, and his fear of failing his own family. I listened, but I didn't offer to pay. I didn't offer a loan. I told him that he had been leaning on me since his 20s, and that by helping him, I had actually prevented him from becoming a man. I told him that his daughter, Cassidy, was his responsibility, not mine. And I told him that my love for him was separate from my willingness to be his bank account. "Do you hate me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I don't have the energy for hate, Brian," I said, "but I am disappointed, and I am finished pretending that I'm not." He left an hour later, smaller than he had arrived. He didn't take any money. He didn't take any promises. He took only the knowledge that the version of his mother who would silently endure his greed was gone forever. After he left, the house settled into a peace that was so profound it felt like a presence. I sat in my armchair and watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. I felt a sense of sovereignty that I hadn't felt in 40 years. The final act of my reclamation took place a week later in Mr. Kent's office. I sat with Lucy, the only member of my family who had seen me as a human being throughout this entire ordeal. I signed the documents that established a trust that Brian and Laura could never touch. The house, my savings, and my legacy were now legally bound to Lucy's future. I wasn't doing it to spite Brian. I was doing it to reward the only person who had the decency to ask if I was safe. As we walked out of the office, Lucy took my hand. "Are you going to be okay, Grandma?" she asked. I looked at the street, at the people moving about their lives, and at the steady, unwavering strength in my own heart. "I'm better than okay, sweetheart," I said. "I'm mine again." My journey didn't end with a grand celebration or a dramatic reconciliation. It ended with a quiet morning in my kitchen, a working phone, a bank account that belonged only to me, and a cup of tea that I finally had the time to finish while it was still hot. I had survived the silence, dismantled the lies, and rebuilt my life on a foundation of truth. To anyone who feels small, to anyone who feels their voice is being muffled by the people who claim to love them, do not wait for permission to be yourself. Start today. Start quietly. But for heaven's sake, start. The silence is over, and the rest of my life, it belongs to me. If your family tried to take control of your life for your own good, would you fight back, yes or no?